Claire Berman. Thank you very much for contributing your story to our issue 47. The story was very revealing to me about people with chronic illness and your portrayal of the female character and her struggles with the body image and being understood in the doctor's office, as well as the setting, which is in COVID and she's isolated, I found to be all very relevant and relatable. Um, so, welcome. Would you like to say something about yourself before we get started?
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be here. My name is Claire Berman. I live in Boston and I'm a writer. I love to write essays and fiction and poetry. And in my day job, I'm a health communicator and I specialize in pediatric HIV. And it's really wonderful to be here.
Would you like to share a little bit about your story?
Yes, I would love to. So I'll start reading from the beginning and then I'll go to a later passage. As he works in my kitchen, Mike tells me about the extraordinary ways mice survive. You wouldn't believe the things I've seen, he says with a hint of incredulity. He tells me of mice scaling smooth walls sideways, of licking oil bottles for sustenance, of taking up residence inside the arms of couches. Mike's easy laugh booms through his cloth mask, which his crinkling brown eyes pull high on his face. He adjusts it often. I ask questions about his work, desperate to prolong this rare human contact. It's a July day, early in an already endless quarantine. Mike can't see, but I'm panting under my mask. It's been months since I got sick with COVID in the panicky first wave of the pandemic, and my body is still recovering. Stony cobwebs weigh down my lungs. Chaotic darts of pain shoot through my heart. There are mouse traps everywhere in my apartment, but the mice seem wholly unbothered by them. They lick the traps clean and scamper into my wall, down to the bowels of the basement. It feels as though the traps are laid for me instead. As I pace my lonely apartment, I occasionally brush up against one, and it snaps into the empty air, making my pulse race in my ears. Almost ashamed to kill mice as smart as these, Mike quips in a thick and familiar Boston accent. I watch the top of his head as he kneels and plugs a hole behind my stove. His weathered forehead softens into curvy waves of jet black hair. He uses a thin rod to stuff bundles of steel wool into my wall and then grimaces, pulling himself up and stretching his broad shoulders. Are you okay? I ask. Bad back, he says, and a migraine. I'm sorry, I get those too. The worst, he says, bending again over a mousetrap. Had 'em since I was a kid. He glances over his shoulder at me. You? Mine started when I was 20. I had one almost every day my senior year in college. Out of breath from so many words, I pause, arch my neck, and use my shoulders to breathe. I'm writing a character who gets them. No kidding, I write too, he says, suddenly shy. I mean, nothing real yet. I mostly write a lot of notes in my phone. What do you write about? He thinks for a moment, the mousetrap suspended in his hand and ready to snap. I guess the crux of it is, how do you go on living when there's no hope for a cure for what you have? That same summer of the mice, when I am well acquainted with my bed and couch, but not much else, a friend recommends a romance novel about a woman with a chronic illness. By this time, the energy for any activity, even reading, is something I must carefully budget. Slowly, pausing often to rest, I begin. The heroine is Chloe, a young woman with fibromyalgia and medication patches hidden under her clothes. She rarely leaves the house, and the messiness in her home corresponds directly with her level of pain. Her apartment is her comfortable retreat, but also the place she struggles to escape. The title of the book, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, speaks to her goal. As someone with a chronic illness, she wants to learn how to live her young adult life and thrive with the body she's got. When a handsome repairman appears at her door, it sets off an enemies to lovers arc. A major part of Chloe's story is her struggle to be forthright about her pain and to trust him with the truth. So now I'll skip ahead. And what I'm skipping over is having many visits from Mike, the exterminator, who returns over and over to attempt to rid me of the mice, as I'm also navigating many healthcare appointments and trying to find some treatment that will work for my long COVID. And all of this is happening as I'm slowly reading this romance novel and Chloe's story. Between Mike's visits, while the mice are busy gnawing through my freshly sealed walls, I think of Chloe. It isn't just her finding someone who loves her that is so powerful. It's that nothing about her illness has to change for her to receive real love. I read the book curled on my couch, unable to walk further than my kitchen or even sit up some days. Clutter builds up around me until I have a bout of energy to clean, which in turn prompts the need to rest. I think about the many years I settled for anyone who would accommodate my body's dysfunctions, anyone who would tolerate my physical shortcomings, even if there were no other signs of love. I was sure I needed a different body, a better body, to be loved. It isn't easy for Chloe either, but when she and her beau finally get their happy ending, her pain patches are still there underneath her clothes, just like before. She's managing it, and she is living. She's the first character I've come across whose chronically ill body doesn't need to change at all before she can be lovable. The only thing that needed changing was her acceptance. She is a revelation.
That was wonderful. And so let's begin with Mike. Mike is an exterminator. He's the kind of the only person you're seeing. And you all are able to have these moments of human connection that really open up a new world, not just about the life of mice, but also just sort of that everyone has pain and illness and hopes. And for instance, Mike writes, but also Mike has the back pain, but he's still working. How did your character relate to Mike in a way that the relationship became so instrumental to the protagonist's growth?
Mike's question that he poses within his own writing to me felt so uh, brilliant and profound and vulnerable. His question of how do you go on living when there's no hope for a cure for what you have? And I think for me, what it did was it opened up such an unexpectedly deep connection. Um, I was expecting sort of a routine exterminator visit that would not last very long because it's always the time crunch when folks are working. And I kind of imagine that Mike also felt um, some isolation as well. He was going into homes and everyone was masking, and he said people were staying in the other room, and so he also wasn't getting the same contact that he was used to. And so he may have also been craving some of these long visits and conversation. And I think Mike's question to me was sort of an affirmation that he really deeply understood this experience of chronic illness. Um, it's, I met him when I was very much in the throes of long COVID before I had seen any improvement in my symptoms. And I think that his question really signaled to me that he was someone who could understand this experience on some level and that he wouldn't try to fix me. And, I think that it was so vulnerable of him really to do that. And it opened up such a beautiful connection and very affirming connection that I think we both needed in that moment.
Yes. And it was lovely the way the exchange was very short, but yet so full of everything, and so many words and thoughts and things to contemplate. And so moving on to the protagonist reading this book about Chloe Brown. I always find it, really enthralling when I read a book and I can relate really strongly with the character. And
Mhm.
that seems to be the case with your main character and the character in the book. Um, so when Chloe Brown, I guess, has the happy ending, and your character has the big revelation that she can be loved and that beauty is beauty and illness can be synonymous, or at least, agreeable. What did that, when you were writing that as an author, what were you trying to get across to the reader?
That's another great question. I think for me, as I look back on the writing process for this essay, I actually started writing it in 2021. And this is when I still had really no relief from my symptoms from long COVID. And originally, I began writing this in a class called Mythic Memoir. And I was originally using the myth of Eurydice and Orpheus to think about repetitive cycles of chronic illness flare ups and how inescapable they can feel. And, I think that I kept having this niggling feeling that I wasn't quite there with the essay yet, that I wasn't quite touching on the thing that needed to be looked at. And I think I realized at some point that the thing I was most scared to write about was my body image and how it relates um, to chronic illness specifically, and having a body that doesn't always, uh, behave as I expect it to. Part of why I started uh, focusing on a romance novel was that, in this class, when we were speaking about mythic memoir and using mythology as a backbone to a story, it didn't occur to me until much later that we could consider romance novels to be a type of mythology as well, and one that within our culture is pretty prominent. I would say, whether we're readers of romance novels or not, there, at least for me, I have often felt sort of um, this sort of like happy ever after uh, myth as something that can feel like a lot of pressure. And so, for me, being able to kind of think about um, a character in that position of being an actual heroine of a romance novel was pretty revelatory, considering that she had a body like mine. And it wasn't about looks, even. It was much more deep than that for me. It was much more about how my body functions and the way that I can feel inside my own body that can be pretty major blocks for me. And so, it wasn't until I sort of started thinking about it in that framework that the pieces of this essay finally came together. And I felt like I had written something that I was actually pretty scared to write.
Writing can be challenging. I agree. But I believe that you really encompass so many beautiful thoughts and ideas that, from your mythology thinking to romance novels to having working in healthcare, and of course having your own personal battles, that you just brilliantly expressed it all in this beautiful essay. Um, I guess I would like to move on just to the title. So we've talked so much about the two characters and the protagonist. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the title, A Love Story All the Same, and what you thought about when you created that title as a reflection of this totality of the story.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It's partly it's that I wanted to play off of the expectations that, romance novels give us. And since one of the threads is about a romance novel, um, the expectation and promise of a romance novel is that the love interests will always get together at the end and they'll have a happy ending. Um, and happy ending meaning that they find romantic love with each other. But for me, the story with Mike was about so much more than just romantic love. A lot of my friends were teasing me relentlessly this whole time, and wondering, why we weren't dating, and you know um kind of framing his visits as like, well, he's staying a long time at each visit, it must mean. But I think that for me, when I think about the idea of love, I really think about giving compassionate attention. And I think that's really what unites all of the threads in my essay. For me, is this idea of compassionate attention as a form of love. Mike and I gave that to each other, in a deeply isolating time. We were both masked. I never saw his whole face once this whole time. And yet he gave me such a rare gift, which was this gift of time and compassionate attention, as we talked about our shared experiences of illness, our love of writing, and about mice. I mean, half the stories Mike told me about mice didn't even make it into the essay. But I think we really gave that to each other. I think Talia Hibbert, who's the author of Get a Life, Chloe Brown, she gives Chloe as a character that, and gives us as readers compassionate attention as she, creates this beautiful novel that centers a really, I think, realistic experience of chronic illness. The breathing specialist who eventually helps me, towards the end of my
Yes.
essay, gives me that too. It's something that as a female patient, it can it doesn't always feel like a guarantee to receive that, and she gives that to me. And just the act of giving that kind of compassion in a healthcare setting and believing me, I think was an act of love. Especially because at the time, long COVID was so, it was just really not understood. I'm sure it's really not that understood now, but especially then. And she still believed me. And, to me, then these are all the lessons that I think, rather than attempting, to kind of think of it as a type of romantic love, these are the lessons that I tried to carry forward when I finally turned towards my own body at the end. And I'm able to, sort of from the inside out, see it as more than just a failure of society's beauty standards, and maybe more than, the way that I've sometimes felt, that it doesn't function the way I want to. And I was able to really turn compassionate attention towards my body, and finally, kind of find a sense of beauty there for how hard it tries and what it's able to
Absolutely.
do.
Absolutely. It was definitely a love story. It was really, really a beautiful story. So, Claire, there's a humorous part of your essay in which you learn a lot about the lives and habits of mice. And for all of us who've lived in New York City, you may have gone through this yourself. I know I have. I found it absolutely hilarious that, the juxtaposition of being in isolation and having to stay in this, small area, and the mice are just running everywhere. They're everywhere. They have this total freedom. It was quite funny in a funny way, funny to me. And I'm wondering, how did that part of the story evolve? I know you had the visits from Mike, but the stories of the mice, did it come just from Mike's personality, or did you add that in for a humorous context?
Mike was so funny. So he had this sort of classic, thick Boston accent, and he just the way he would tell me these stories, like it was almost like he was an emissary from the rest of Boston, reporting to me on all the mice happenings throughout the city and rats. So it was something that partly comes from Mike's personality and the way that he told me, all these funny stories about the other encounters that people were having with mice and rats. And I think the funniest to me was the tiny blue footprints, which is also the part that my 4-year-old niece really loves, that story, of all the teeny tiny footprints that are all over my apartment suddenly illuminated. It's like an absurd horror story. And you see, like, everywhere they've been and everywhere they've touched.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
I definitely gasped at that point in the book, in the
So did
story.
I.
Is there anybody or anyone that you would like to acknowledge for writing this wonderful essay?
Thank you. Yes. Well, I want to acknowledge Talia Hibbert. who wrote Get a Life, Chloe Brown, which is the romance novel that I reference in the essay. It's a really beautiful story, and I'm grateful to her for writing it and making me, and I'm sure many other readers, feel so seen. This is my first publication, and I wasn't sure really what to expect when it came to an editing process, but I just really wanted to thank Scott Oglesby and Danielle Ofrey for their wonderful and supportive editing. I think they really gave me compassionate attention, in the way that they approached the editing and made it, I think, so much stronger, while also really, I think, seeing and preserving sort of the core of what I wanted to get across. And yeah, I'm very grateful to have been able to write this essay with the support of so many of my writing group members and writing partners. So yes, thank you so much for including me in this wonderful event.
It sounds like you have a wonderful community, and thank you for being a part of the Bellevue Literary Review. We are honored to have you in issue 47.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual.